Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi. I feel like it has been so long since I've done a live, and I did so many at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm glad that we're doing this. Hi. So we're going to talk about boundaries. Specifically, I wanted to give you all the opportunity to ask some specific boundary scripts, and I can kind of explain the way that I structure boundaries and how I conceptualize them, because I don't want to just make you dependent kind of on a boundary script that I give you, right? Good morning. I want to be able to teach you kind of how to do it, and I'm coming out with a boundary course that's going to actually break down exactly how to do it, so stay tuned for that. It's going to give you kind of like a recipe for exactly ways to say things and exactly ways to work through different things, so keep an eye out on that. But before I kind of start talking about boundaries, I wanted to give you all an opportunity, if you have specific questions about something, how to say this, how to say that, type them below, and I will see how many of those I can answer. Let me see if there's any that have come in so far. I don't think so. Just people kind of, all right, so Romy okay, so we're talking about shame. We're talking about an abusive boss. Yeah, I'm gonna actually, after tonight, I have one plan to go over boundaries. I think it's really hard with boundaries when we start getting in abuse. For someone who just asked, if you have specific boundary questions, feel free to ask them below. So abusive bosses, or just abuse in general, is really hard with boundaries, because you're not going to be able to have a healthy boundary with someone that's being abusive to you. Because most of the time when we're talking about abuse, someone is not respecting your boundaries to begin with, right? So if someone doesn't respect our boundaries at all, and they don't actually listen to us when we're trying to compromise or we're trying to work on a solution together, and it's just their way and they completely ignore our boundaries, you're gonna actually need more like a wall or rigid boundaries. So the way that I kind of talk about, if you look back at my post that I did a couple days ago, or I guess it was last week, I kind of talked about the boundary scale and how we go from porous, which is kind of like the opposite of rigid, where we often are enmeshed with people. We feel like everything may be our fault. We maybe share too much. We maybe really struggle with setting or maintaining boundaries, even though we want to. That's where sometimes if we have some people-pleasing tendencies, we may have porous boundaries, all the way over to rigid, which we get cut off for disconnection because we don't feel like we can let people in at all. We feel like we can't be vulnerable. And of course, there are different levels of safe or unsafe people. So in the case of abuse, that's definitely an unsafe person. So I think it's going to be really hard to set any type of healthy boundary with that person. I don't know how abusive or exactly what the situation is that you're going through, but if it's possible, I would try to talk to HR, but I would also really maybe look back in your contract, see what the actual things are that are required of you, because if it is just kind of like your boss is really pushing boundaries, not letting you set boundaries, that's where you need a really rigid boundary or a wall of kind of being really clear, not asking any for compromise. You know, if you looked at some of the boundary script I wrote, some of them have compromises in them, right? Some of them say, I can't do tonight, but could you do tomorrow? That's a boundary negotiation or a compromise. And we do those in healthy boundary situations where we are close to that person and we trust that they will respect our boundaries. If someone continuously doesn't respect our boundaries, we're not going to really want to give them any room to negotiate with us, because if we give them a negotiation, they're going to probably take way more than we're giving them. All right, if that makes sense. Let's see. Coworkers that are passive aggressive, that's another good one. I think one thing and this is helpful for just everyone learning about boundaries, is when someone is acting in a way that's passive aggressive, a lot of people don't recognize that they're being passive aggressive. So I think it is important, if you look at the way that I set boundaries, a lot of times I refrain from like labeling things, because often if we come at someone or we just try to have a conversation with someone and we label their behavior in some way, even if it's just saying, hey, I feel like you're being passive aggressive, sometimes people will argue with us about that. So it depends on the person. You know them, you know the situation. But if someone tends to be defensive, I would try to do everything in setting that boundary to not give them anything to defend against. I would stick to really clearly saying their behavior in terms of describing it. So saying, rather than saying to that coworker, hey, I feel like you're being passive aggressive, and then setting the boundary from there, I would actually start with trying to describe what their behavior looks like in very plain, simple, non-labeling, factual terms that someone can't really argue with us over. So literally, if you can, repeating what they said to you. So rather than saying, hey, I feel like you're being really passive aggressive with me lately, can we talk about this? I would say something like, again, and use the example that fits here. Let's say that they said to you, like, must be nice to, I don't know, whatever, not get the hard work at work. You could say to them, hey, I noticed that you said blank to me. I interpreted that as being kind of passive aggressive. I just wanted to bring this up with you. Is there something going on? Because a lot of times with passive aggressive too, there's something deeper going on for that person, right? It's like a lot of times people exhibit passive aggressive language when they're actually wanting to be kind of aggressive, right? Or they actually have some anger or frustration or something going on, but they either can't express it or don't feel like they're able to express it. So trying to ask someone, hey, what's going on? Can you tell me, is there something that I've done? Or giving them a space to kind of explain. And maybe it's not about you. Maybe they just like are having a bad day or have had multiple bad days, and that's just the way that it's coming out. But I think giving them a space to respond and be able to share is kind of one of the best ways to work through that. Of course, if it keeps happening, it may be that you want to separate yourself from that person. It may be if you give them a space and they're like being rude to you, or they just continue to be passive aggressive and they don't actually take that invitation. Like you're kind of, when you say like, hey, is everything okay? I'm interpreting it this way. You're really trying to open up the conversation and give them a space to kind of be vulnerable and share what's going on. And if they reject that and they don't actually walk into that vulnerable place, they're probably not in a place where they want to be honest. So it's going to be hard to create that connection with that person. And if they just continue acting passive aggressively and don't acknowledge that there's something else going on, you probably need to just set boundaries with them, especially if they don't actually respect your boundaries and just make fun of you, for example, or say something else passive aggressive in response. That's going to be when I would say you set some kind of boundary, you pull away, you don't interact with them as much, you keep things like a lot more on the surface, because there are different levels of people, and part of what's so hard about setting boundaries is they're different for everyone and they're different for all of our situations. So as you start setting more boundaries, you're going to start to notice like who responds well to your boundaries, who doesn't, and that will give you a sense of where you should kind of be on that spectrum with that person, from kind of porous to rigid, if that makes sense. Ooh, this is a really good one, Steph. I'm a college student, and boundaries with parents, especially while living with them, is very difficult because feelings get hurt along the way. Yes, I think especially like young adulthood is one of the most difficult times, because parents haven't fully acknowledged a lot of times that, their kid has grown up, has maybe moved out, is able to set boundaries for themselves. And I think like living at home also, I'm sure a lot of you all who maybe were supposed to be going away to college this year or have and had to come home, or maybe you started and you're already back, it's such a tough spot to be in. So I think trying to remember what's hard is when we live at home, our parents are allowed to set boundaries with us, right? Like they, in some ways, they make the rules, and we often don't, if they have a certain, like, you know, rule or belief about what is acceptable in their house, it's not often that we really can necessarily change it, or we can argue for our case or advocate for what we want. But if they have a really specific rule that isn't really movable, there's not a lot that we can necessarily do. But at the same time, Steph, you also have a right to set boundaries too. And I think that's what's hard, is a lot of parents will have rules or boundaries in their house, but then they don't necessarily respect or understand that their child can also set boundaries for themselves too. So Steph, it sounds like, you know, their feelings are getting hurt as you're trying to set boundaries. And that's where I would really, really heavily lean into understanding what's going on behind it. So a lot of the boundary scripts you saw when it comes to friends or parents, really heavily relying on that like first statement of like, I know that this is because you love me. Because at the end of the day, unless your parents are abusive, and I would argue a lot of parents who are abusive still love their kids, even if they don't do it in a healthy way. My guess is you know that your parents love you and are doing whatever they're doing, or not liking your boundaries out of love in some capacity. So that's where I would rely stuff on saying like, hey, mom and dad, I know that you really love me. I know you're worried about me, or I know that it's probably weird to have me set boundaries, and then using that or at the same time. Because one of the biggest mistakes I see is people say, I know that you love me, but I need to do this. And unfortunately, just linguistically, when we say X but Y, our brain kind of like crosses out the X and we really, really focus on the Y. So you can use the word and. If it's weird for you and you feel like and sounds weird, you can also use the word at the same time. That's a really helpful way to say that. And it really shows that both of these things are true at the same time, Steph. Let me scroll down and see if you've written anything back. Yeah, so saying stuff like at the same, I know that you love me so much, at the same time, I need to be able to do this, or I need to be able to do that, or stuff. I don't know if maybe like your parents are not used to you being, home or whatever, and they're trying to say that you can't do certain things. Obviously with COVID, there's like a whole nother layer of complicated things, but really getting that you know that they love you and that that's where this boundary is coming from can really, really break down some resistance or some defensiveness, right? The other thing that I was going to tell you is, I know that you said that their feelings have been hurt, and yeah, it could be because you're using but. They're not really getting how much you know that they love you. And if their feelings are getting hurt, and this is a really great tip for everyone too, I love using the language like when you say something, you can say the words, I'm making up in my head this. Right, so you could say them, let's just use an example, Steph. Let's say that your parents are, I don't know, I'm gonna use a random example that probably doesn't apply to COVID, so don't at me, I know this may not apply to everyone. Let's say that your parents want you to be home by 10 o'clock, you're used to being at college, this feels like really stifling for you, whatever. You could say, like if you just say how it feels for you, their feelings may get hurt, right? So if you say like, you don't care about me, or this isn't fair, or like any of those things that just kind of classify someone's behavior, that person is going to often get defensive. So a really helpful way to soften that, but also still being honest, hey Abby, is to say something like, when you say this, I feel this, I feel like this, right? So saying like, hey mom, when you say that I can't do this, when I can't go out, instead of just saying like, it's not fair because I'm an adult and I should be able to do what I want and that's my boundary. Instead, what I would say is, hey mom, when you say this, I feel like you don't trust me, or I feel frustrated because I feel like I'm not going to be able to I feel like I'm afraid I'm going to lose my friends. Saying what the narrative is for you. Or mom, when you say X, I make up this. Like I make up this story in my head. That gives people some space for She's not going to debate you about the story that you're making up in your head, where she may debate you or get defensive about her intentions, right? But if you say, like, I make up that you don't trust me, that's super different than saying you don't trust me, because she's going to say, yes, I do. And then you're going to be arguing about something that isn't even actually what you're trying to talk about. So phrases like, I'm making up this, the story in my head is this, my interpretation of this is this, or even it occurs to me like this. By the way, these are all really great words if with your significant others. Anyone who's close to you, saying those words just really like tends to turn down the heat on what we're going on. Yes, great stuff. So yeah, I would lean into some of those phrases. Practice, write out what you're gonna say first too. That's a really big help, so that you have some phrases that you can remember. Don't use and or don't use but, try to do and try to like really listen to what their concerns are and what they're saying. And this is the thing too, is you can hear what someone's saying, fully listen, and you can still have a boundary, right? I can fully listen to what everyone is saying. And I think sometimes those of us that have more porous boundaries and don't trust ourselves as much don't even want to hear what someone's going to say, because we're afraid that we're going to be swept up in what someone else is saying. We're afraid we're going to like lose our thoughts. So that's where I would practice. I would practice writing down what your values are, what you believe, what your boundaries are, what you need, and then you can fully listen to someone and still come back to what you need. You can empathize with someone without agreeing with them or changing your stance. And I think that's a really, really powerful tip just for communication in general. All right. Let's see, Autumn. Okay, any ideas on how to communicate with someone you're in a relationship with who strongly dislikes serious talks and communication? I just want to say, Autumn, this is so hard. I think this is one of the most difficult things, and I think it's really hard because, right, my guess is I would start to learn some of the triggers that the person that you're in a relationship has. If it's saying things kind of like, can we talk? And maybe that's a trigger for them, I would try to avoid that. I think having a conversation though first about communication. So often when someone doesn't like to communicate with us, I think we put off having a sorry guys, that paused for a second. I think so often we put off having a difficult conversation with someone sometimes because we know that they don't want to have the conversation with us. So then we push it off and wait until we can't possibly hold it in anymore. And so what I want you to say instead is something like, I want you to have a conversation about communication first. And I want you to be clear with your partner. I'm not trying to get you to talk about something. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to make anything happen. Be really clear. The intention of the conversation is just to talk about communication in general. And I think the person may be more open to that. See if there are certain times of day or certain things. Like, think about in your relationship, where are the times where that person opens up? Is it driving in the car and sometimes they have their mind on something and they're more able to open up? Is it when you all go for a walk together? Is it at the end of the day when, work is done? Pick the time that you think would work best. And I think asking the if you come up to them and you kind of say like, I would love to chat with you just about communication in general. I know you don't like this. Like, this is where you could also say like, I know it's really hard for you to open up and talk about things. At the same time, I really like you. I really care about you, and I'm really wanting our relationship to work. And I know that for a relationship to work, I need to be able to express different things and communicate. Is there a time that would work best for us to be able to talk? And almost let them kind of choose when the talk would be best, what the boundaries are around that conversation. Because I think too, what can also happen when people don't like talking, the other person almost ends up nagging them a lot. And you're like always trying to get them to talk. And then the other person feels like you guys are always talking because someone's always trying to start the conversation and someone else is always trying to shut it down. So maybe even scheduling a time, like once a week, you all sit down and just chat about something to kind of take some of the pressure off, maybe. All right. How to communicate and allow your partner to voice their opinion when you seem to dominate the conversation. When you ask them to share, they shut down or say nothing and agree with you. Let's see. I'm trying to see exactly what we're trying to say with this one. When you voice their opinion, when you seem to dominate the conversation. Okay, I get what you're saying. Well, I think you can ask them what it's like for them. I think you could say something. I think this could be a really powerful thing. If you had a conversation with them and you said, hey, I'm like doing some reflecting and I noticed that I really dominate our conversations and I don't like that. I really care about what you think and what your opinion is, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and say, take ownership of that and ask you, what is it like for you? You could ask them that. You could also say, like, I really care about hearing your perspective. Do I interrupt you and I don't realize it? Giving them space to be able to share what it's like for them. And if they can tell you, what triggers them to shut down, because you actually care. I mean, it sounds like you really care about their opinion. Maybe you're more opinionated than them, but maybe that person's really afraid of confrontation and they see you as being like dominant and knowing, what you believe in, and they aren't sure. You may just not know what the triggers are where they get overwhelmed by the conversation and shut down. So I would just ask them what it's like for them. Really asking open-ended questions is so, so, so powerful, because so often if we don't know what's going on with someone, we color in what we think is going on. And sometimes it's completely different than what they're going through. All right, I wanted to get to, let's see. How do we set boundaries with friends who add just kidding after commenting on our body? I am so big on nobody has a right to comment on our bodies. And I think the world would be a much better place if we all didn't comment on each other's bodies. So, and this I think also goes for any time someone kind of says something and then says, just kidding. I would say saying something like, I know that you're just kidding, because that person, says that they're just kidding. And saying even like, I care about your friendship a lot. I know that you're just kidding when you say X. At the same time, it's really difficult for me when you comment on your body, or say at the same time, I am really uncomfortable with anyone commenting on my body. Please don't comment on my body, even if it's a joke. And you may have to set that boundary a few times. I think that's another big misconception with boundaries, is we think often, and I think sometimes social media is so simplistic, which is great, but also sometimes lacks nuance, right? In that we think that if I set a boundary once and someone doesn't listen to that boundary, it means that they don't respect my boundary necessarily. And sometimes boundaries, especially hard ones, may need to be communicated a few times, and they may need to be restated, right? Like, I'll give you an example of how this may go, okay? Let's say your friend makes a comment on your body. They say, I was just kidding. You say, hey, I know that you're just kidding, and it really is difficult for me when you comment on my body. Please don't comment on my body, even when you're joking. The person goes, oh, come on, I was just kidding. Stop being so weird, or stop, they kind of push back on you. And you say, I'm actually being serious right now. It really is unhealthy for me to have people comment on my body. Please don't do it. And they may push back again, and you could just be like, look, this just doesn't work for me. Please don't comment on my body. You're allowed to repeat that. Sometimes we need to repeat the same thing a few times for someone to really get our communication and get our boundary too. Because when people are talking, they're not 100% necessarily focused on what we're saying. So you have a right to restate that boundary. And if that person continues to not listen to that boundary, you also have a right to set a consequence. That is kind of like the next level of kind of upping the ante with a boundary, of saying to someone, hey, I know that, you don't mean any harm, whatever. At the same time, I've set this boundary a few times, and if you can't hang out with me and not comment on my body, I'm not going to be able to spend time with you, and I don't want that, for example. That could be kind of a consequence. You could be if it really doesn't work for you, you could be super clear that you can't have a friendship with them anymore. Or maybe there are certain things you guys do together that brings up more boundary or body conversations. Like, I don't know if when you go to the beach, the person makes more comments, or I don't know, I'm trying to think of another situation that may, have them bring up, I don't know, maybe going to the gym, something like that. Maybe then you set the boundary, and maybe you tell them, maybe you don't, that you don't spend time with them at those places because that's where they disrespect your boundaries. All right. Let's see. This is a good question, Christina, or Nina Christina. Okay. How to communicate with your friends that you feel distant from them because you somehow cannot connect with them any longer. I mean, first, what I would say about this is you have a right to say this. I think that a lot of people try to say that you don't necessarily have a right to say that. I would be honest, see if there's anything going on with you that's making you more disconnected with them. If it's not on your end at all, I would just say that. I would just be like, look, I really feel like disconnected from you lately. Also, a lot of the words I use are very like therapeutic, kind of like formal. So feel free to change the words, make it fit you, write them down, practice saying it so you don't sound like you don't feel uncomfortable with the way that you're saying it. But I think just being honest with them and just being like, hey, what's going on? You're one of my really good friends. I feel distant from you. Did I do something wrong? Is there something going on with you that I don't know about? I just miss you. And I think just saying that, I think really opens up, right? Like, it's kind of a bid for connection. You're giving them a space to be vulnerable. And it's when someone is healthy, and I will preface it with that, if we are vulnerable first, a lot of times people will match our vulnerability. If we say, hey, I've been really struggling with the pandemic and I feel really disconnected from everyone, and I especially feel disconnected from you. Like, are you going through this? What's going on? Really often when we say that, we give someone a space to kind of walk into and respond. Or if there's a way that maybe we have been doing something and we kind of take ownership of that, that also gives someone a space to walk into. If you say something kind of like, I've been pretending that everything's fine with us, but actually I feel really disconnected from you, and I just wanted to check in and see how you were feeling. That's a vulnerable statement that also can prompt someone to like walk into that and be vulnerable back. Boundaries with someone who emotionally dumps on you. So that would really, oh, sorry. Okay, boundaries with someone who emotionally dumps on you. This one is from Nina Christina. Sorry about that. I mixed up your names. Okay, I can't get distracted. All right. Saying something like, hey, I'm so glad that I can support you. I love being able to support you. At the same time, I don't know, whenever this person kind of dumps on you, I think being like, it's too exhausting for me. I don't always have the energy to engage in this conversation to support you. And maybe trying to like ask them if there's someone else that they can call. I wish one thing that happened, I wish people in general would kind of like normalize consent with like emotionally dumping, because I think it's something that we tend to do really often, and we don't ask someone like, hey, do you have time to chat right now? Can I just vent for a minute? And we don't often ask for permission. But yeah, I think telling the person like, I love being able to support you and I'm going through so much stuff right now, I can't support you right now. If it's more of a problem in general that you need to address as like a whole relationship, this one's a little more tricky. I would first see like, do you actually want to be friends with this person? Does this person bring you value? Are they someone that you enjoy spending time with, so that you can be clear, if this person, I think we should be in a place where we choose our friendships also. And if all we're getting from this friendship is someone emotionally dumping on you, it may not be the most healthy. So saying, hey, I feel like lately, and this is where I would really lean into saying something like, I'm making up, it occurs to me, it feels like, so that they don't just come off as being really defensive when you try to address this behavior. I think saying something like, I don't know if it's just because of the pandemic and things are like tougher for me or I have less energy. Lately, it feels like our conversations are a little one-sided, and I don't know if that's because I'm not setting boundaries or not, but I just wanted to be honest and tell you that this is how I'm feeling because I do care about our friendship. And it would really make a difference for me if when we had conversations, they were a little bit more one-sided or two-sided, and they were a little bit more of a conversation versus me just supporting you, because you know that I love to support you. At the same time, I need support too. Something like that. I think the other thing you could do with this person is maybe you don't talk to them on the phone as much. Sometimes emotionally dumping can happen on the phone. I know it's hard with COVID, but maybe you all go for a walk. When you hang out more, you try to schedule something to do where you're not just kind of being held hostage by someone. If it is a situation too where you could take a little bit easier of a route of just addressing it, like I said, kind of time by time. You could also, when someone calls you and they start talking, you could be like, hey, I actually don't have that much time. I only have 10 minutes. Is this something that we can just chat about quickly? If not, let's schedule a time to talk over the weekend or something like that, if that makes sense. Oh my, lots of questions. Okay. Let's see. Let me see. Okay. All right, so we have a couple people asking about boyfriends liking pictures on Instagram and that you feel insecure. So I would definitely, you have a right to have a conversation with your boyfriend. You have a right to say hey, I've noticed that you've liked a lot of girls' pictures on Instagram. He may say no, I haven't, and you may have to give specifics. But I think that's where you really say, hey, when I see this happening, when I see you liking a lot of girls' pictures on Instagram that don't have a ton of clothing, or however you want to say it, it feels like blank. And then you share authentically what it feels like to you. Does it feel like a betrayal? Does it feel like he's not interested in you? Does it feel like he likes these girls more? But share it as it feels like this way for me, or the story I'm making up is this. Because then he really understands what the impact is on you, versus if you say, you're liking all these pictures and you like these girls more than me, it's gonna be a whole defensive conversation about him saying that he doesn't. Rather than if you share what it's like for you, he's a lot more likely to get why it's hard for you and actually change the behavior, or at least be able to reassure you and understand what's going on. All right, y'all. Well, I have a boundaries course coming up. Stay tuned if you're interested. The people on my on my email will have the most access to this. I'm going to try to save this live to also put it in my IGTV. Sometimes Instagram's a little weird, but I'm going to try to pop on and get back into the habit of doing more lives. All right. I hope you all have a great day, and I hope that this was helpful. And if there's another type of boundary that you have questions about, you can shoot me a DM or comment on my most recent post. That's where I kind of get inspiration for new posts, and I will try to make you a script. All right, bye.